Most people would think the most heartbreaking part is when a mother elephant gives birth to twins and loses one of them before mourning. But that wasn't the moment that brought everyone to tears. What no one expected was what happened after the loss. She didn't turn back to the calf that was still alive. She stayed beside the tiny body growing cold, as if a mother's love simply refused to believe it was over. And as the surviving calf began to weaken right at her feet, both the herd and the humans watching were pulled into something painful, mysterious, and unforgettable. Because what she did next wasn't just instinct. It was a goodbye, and a choice that left everyone in tears. By late afternoon, the wildlife rescue station in northern Kenya had gone strangely quiet. The air still held the dry heat of the day, but the sky above the thorn trees had turned the color of bruised copper. In the maternity enclosure, Mara stood apart from the rest of the herd, her massive sides tightening into slow waves as another contraction moved through her. She was nearly 30, broad-headed and steady, with the kind of presence that made younger elephants fall silent when she passed. Normally, Mara carried herself with calm authority, but tonight there was a tremor beneath her stillness. Every few minutes, her trunk swept the dirt, then curled back toward her belly, as if she were trying to understand what her own body was preparing to do. From the elevated observation deck, Ethan Cole lowered his binoculars and said nothing for a long moment. He had worked around injured rhinos, orphaned lions, and bull elephants fresh from poaching trauma, but something about Mara's posture unsettled him. It was not simple labor pain. It was the guarded tension of an animal stepping toward a moment too large to name. Below him, Dr. Rebecca Shaw checked the monitor clipped to a weather-worn railing and watched the numbers flicker in the growing dark. Mara's labor had been building since dawn, slow and irregular, then suddenly stronger after sunset. Rebecca did not like surprises during elephant births, and she liked rare ones even less. This night, she feared, was carrying both. Noah Bennett, the youngest member of the team, stood a few steps back with a field notebook pressed to his chest. He had spent weeks studying feed schedules, foot care, and herd patterns, but none of it had prepared him for the living gravity of a mother on the edge of birth. When he asked if Mara would be all right, neither Ethan nor Rebecca answered right away, and that silence said more than either of them wanted. 3 nights earlier, the portable scan had shown what Rebecca first thought was a shadowing error. She had checked the image twice, then a third time before calling Ethan over. 2 distinct heartbeats, 2 small bodies crowded in a womb built for one calf at a time. In captive records and field notes alike, twin pregnancies in elephants were almost never followed by uncomplicated joy. They were followed by risk. Ethan remembered the way Mara had looked during that scan, standing patient beneath the acacia shade while flies traced slow circles around her eyes. She had not seemed fragile then. She'd seemed ancient, self-contained, almost beyond harm. Yet the screen had reduced everything to probabilities, and those probabilities were brutal. A twin birth was not a miracle first. In the bush, it was usually a warning. As the light thinned, the herd began to gather around her without being called. The older females moved first, drifting into position with instinctive purpose. At the center of them was old Ruth, scarred along one flank and heavy with age, her ears torn at the edges from years no human had witnessed. She stopped beside Mara and rested her trunk lightly against her shoulder, neither urging nor soothing, only staying. Lena came next, quieter than the others, keeping just outside Ruth's reach. She had lost a calf 2 seasons earlier, during a drought so severe the riverbed split open like old bone. Since then, she had become unusually alert to the cries of young animals, even those not her own. Tonight, her eyes never left Mara's face, as though she recognized a shadow in the laboring mother that no monitor could detect. The rescue team stayed back under strict instructions. No flashlights, no engines, no unnecessary movement. If Mara panicked, the stress alone could turn a difficult birth into catastrophe. So they watched the old way, through glass, through darkness, through patience that felt more like helplessness with each passing minute. Somewhere beyond the fence line, a jackal cried once, and then went silent. A wind moved across the plain just after dusk, carrying the scent of distant rain and dry grass. Mara shifted her weight, let out a low rumble, and lifted one front foot before setting it down again, with care. The sound changed the herd at once. Old Ruth straightened. Lena stepped closer. 2 younger. Females moved into a loose crescent behind Mara, closing the circle as if protecting not only a mother, but the fragile doorway between life and loss. Noah swallowed hard when another contraction hit. Mara's body bowed forward, and for one terrible second, he thought she might fall. But she didn't. She endured it, shuddering, then steadied herself with a slow breath that seemed to travel through her whole frame. Ethan saw the fear in the young man's face and finally spoke, his voice low enough not to drift. This is where nature decides what it can keep. Rebecca glanced at him sharply, but she did not argue. The truth was too near now. They had all read the same reports. In most twin births, one calf arrived stronger, larger, more ready for the ruthless demands of survival. The second often paid the price in silence before anyone had time to call it tragedy. And still, standing under the deepening blue of the African night, none of them could stop hoping Mara might be the exception. Then Mara turned her head and looked out across the enclosure as if listening to something none of them could hear. Her trunk lifted, paused in the cooling air, and lowered again to brush the curve of her swollen belly. The herd held around her like a wall of breathing stone. Above them, the first star appeared, and in the hush before full dark, the whole sanctuary seemed to brace for what was coming next. The night settled in slowly, not with peace, but with the kind of stillness that made every sound feel important. Mara remained at the center of the herd, her body rising and falling under the dim wash of moonlight. The contractions had found a rhythm now, stronger and closer together, and with each one she seemed to disappear deeper into a private place no one else could enter. Around her, the older females held their positions with quiet discipline. Old Ruth stood nearest, her broad body angled to block the wind, while Lena lingered a little farther back, listening, watching, waiting. The younger cows no longer shifted or fidgeted. Even they seemed to understand that the night had crossed into a sacred hour, when movement itself could feel like disrespect. From the observation deck, Ethan watched Mara's silhouette tighten and release against the pale dirt. He had seen difficult births before, but something about this one carried a pressure that settled in his chest and would not leave. Rebecca stood beside him with her arms folded, saying little, though the hard set of her jaw made it clear she was counting every minute the way other people counted heartbeats. Noah tried to write in his notebook, but the words kept shrinking under the weight of the moment. He wrote down times, body posture, vocalizations, then stopped and stared into the darkness below. Mara let out a low, resonant rumble that rolled through the enclosure like distant thunder. It was not loud, but it changed something in the air. The herd tightened without command. A contraction hit hard enough to bend Mara forward at the shoulders. For a breathless second, her front knees dipped, and Noah instinctively stepped toward the stairs before Ethan caught his arm. "No," he whispered, not harshly, but with the force of a rule older than any of them. "If she sees us now, we make this worse." Noah froze, ashamed of his own human need to do something. Mara stayed upright. Her trunk dragged a line through the dirt, then curled under her chest as she steadied herself. Old Ruth moved closer and touched the side of Mara's face with the soft underside of her trunk. It was a brief gesture, almost nothing. But Mara answered with a faint rumble of her own. Rebecca noticed it immediately. "She's still orienting," she said quietly. "She's not lost in panic." That gave them all a little hope. Panic could shatter a laboring elephant. Calm, even strained calm, meant instinct was still leading. A few minutes later, Mara shifted her hind legs apart and braced herself. Her ears moved once, then stilled. The herd fell into complete silence. Even the insects seemed to recede. Then, in the hush beneath the moon, the first calf came into the world. The little body dropped hard onto the wet earth, folded and shining in the blue-gray dark. For half a second, no one breathed. Then the calf twitched. Mara swung around faster than Ethan would have thought possible in her condition, and her whole posture changed. Pain remained in her body, but something else had entered it now. Recognition, urgency, a fierce and immediate tenderness. She reached down with her trunk and began sweeping the membrane away from the calf's face in long, trembling strokes. The small body shuddered, coughed, then moved again. Noah exhaled so sharply it almost turned into a laugh. "It's alive," he whispered, though everyone could already see it. Rebecca lowered her head for a second, not in prayer exactly, but in relief too deep for speech. The calf was small but sturdy-looking, its limbs thick enough to promise strength if strength could be won quickly. Mara touched its back, its ears, its side, as if memorizing every part. When the calf lifted its head for the first time, Ethan felt the tension break across the deck in a wave so sudden it almost left him dizzy. Against the odds, the first baby had arrived breathing and determined. Noah looked to Ethan with the open, stunned smile of someone witnessing grace for the first time. Ethan did not smile back, not fully. He was watching Mara. A healthy mother would have rested in those first moments, leaning into the miracle that had just landed at her feet. But Mara didn't settle. Even as she cleaned the calf, her flank tightened again, and her breathing remained rough and unfinished. Rebecca saw it too. "She's not done," she said, the words flattening the brief joy before it could become celebration. Below them, the calf made another effort to gather its legs beneath itself. Mara turned toward it, rumbling softly now, the sound rich with something almost musical. For one precious minute, the enclosure held the shape of a happy ending, and everyone felt how badly they wanted to believe it. Noah had already begun thinking of names when Ethan spoke without taking his eyes off Mara. "Kai," he said, quietly enough that no one asked why. Maybe it was because the calf had arrived like a small wave breaking through darkness. Maybe it was because hope felt easier to hold if it had a name. Rebecca nodded once. "Kai," she repeated, and wrote it down in the margin of her notes. Then Kai, all trembling legs and impossible courage, pushed himself halfway upright and leaned blindly toward his mother's belly. Mara answered at once, lowering her trunk to guide him. But before he could find her fully, another contraction tore through her with enough force to make her cry out. The sound split the night open. Every head in the herd lifted. The second birth had begun. Mara's cry did not fade right away. It lingered over the enclosure, like something torn loose from deep inside her, raw enough to make even the younger cows go still. Kai, only moments old, flinched at the sound and collapsed back onto the ground in a clumsy heap. The brief glow of relief on the observation deck vanished. No one spoke. The night had turned again. The second wave of labor moved through Mara with a cruelty the first had not carried. Her body had already given one life to the earth, and now it was being asked to do the impossible a second time. She planted her feet wider, trunk hanging low, ears stiff against her neck. Old Ruth stayed beside her, solid and watchful, while Lena shifted nearer to Kai as if some private instinct had drawn her there. Kai tried to rise again, driven by a hunger older than thought. His legs folded under him once, then twice, before he finally managed a shaky stand that lasted no more than a breath. He tipped sideways into the dust and let out a thin, uncertain squeal. Lena answered with a soft rumble, not stepping between him and Mara, only staying close enough to steady the space around him. From above, Noah gripped the rail so tightly his knuckles blanched in the moonlight. The first calf's survival should have been the center of the night. Instead, he could feel everyone being pulled toward the second birth, toward the unseen struggle still trapped inside Mara's body. Rebecca checked her watch, then looked back through her binoculars. The time between contractions was shortening, but Mara was tiring fast. A gust of wind slipped across the plain, carrying the sharp scent of rain and wet soil from somewhere far off. It stirred the dust around Mara's legs and rippled through the acacia branches beyond the fence. Ethan knew weather could change an animal's entire state of mind, and he hated the way the air felt now. Electric, restless, as though the land itself had begun bracing for something it could not prevent. Below, Mara lowered her head and gave a deep, shuddering groan. The sound rolled through the ground more than through the air, and the herd answered in scattered rumbles that never quite became a chorus. They were not comforting her the way humans might have. They were holding the moment with her, keeping the world from splintering while she pushed against pain that seemed to come from every part of her at once. Then the second calf emerged at last, smaller and slower, its body slipping onto the dirt with almost none of the force that had marked Kai's arrival. There was no immediate struggle, no urgent twitching, no quick, offended movement toward life. The calf lay still for one terrible second, its narrow ribs barely visible beneath the slick membrane. Even from the deck, the difference was unmistakable. Mara turned at once. Exhaustion disappeared beneath instinct as she reached for the calf with frantic care, stripping away the birth sac from its face and nose. For a moment, nothing happened. Noah felt his own heartbeat beating up into his throat. Then the calf shivered weakly, drawing in a shallow breath that seemed too small for the size of the world it had just entered. Rebecca let out a breath, but not one of relief. "It's underweight," she said softly, almost to herself. Ethan did not answer. He could already see it in the angle of the limbs, the slightness of the chest, the way the little body seemed built of effort rather than strength. Mara kept touching it, urging it, sweeping her trunk along its spine and under its belly. Where she had guided Kai with tenderness, she now moved with desperate concentration, as if sheer will might fill what nature had withheld. Kai, meanwhile, had found enough balance to take 2 uncertain steps toward his mother's hind leg. He nudged at the air beneath her, searching for milk he could smell, but not yet reach. Mara did not turn to him. Her full attention remained on the smaller calf sprawled at her feet. Lena edged between Kai and the nearest younger female, subtly protecting his space, while old Ruth stared down at the new arrival with grave, unreadable stillness. Noah's voice came out in a whisper. "Is it going to make it?" Rebecca waited too long before answering. "I don't know." In truth, she knew more than she wanted to say. A calf that weak at birth faced impossible odds, even with a strong mother and no competition. But this calf had entered a world where another newborn was already demanding milk, warmth, and every instinct Mara had left to give. The first drops of rain began to fall, slow, scattered, darkening the dust, one mark at a time. Mara ignored them. She bent lower and nudged the second calf again, then again, trying to coax its legs beneath it. The calf managed a faint movement of one foreleg before collapsing back into itself. Its head lifted halfway, then sank. Hope did not vanish all at once. It thinned, quietly, in full view of everyone watching. Ethan studied Mara's face through the binoculars and saw something changing there. Not surrender, not yet, but fear. It was visible in the speed of her movements, the way she kept returning to the calf's mouth and chest, checking for breath, for response, for any sign that effort was still worth spending. He had seen mothers fight predators, drought, gunfire, floodwater. This was different. This was a battle against a silence she could not understand. Kai let out another small cry, sharper now, and lifted his trunk toward Mara's belly. For the first time in his short life, he had to wait while his mother fought for someone else. The younger cows shifted uneasily. Old Ruth did not move. Lena lowered her head toward Kai and answered him with a low, soothing rumble, as if promising nothing and everything at once. On the deck, Noah stopped writing. There was no point pretending this was just observation anymore. The rain held off after those first few drops, leaving the air cool and tense. Around the herd, Mara remained bent over the smaller calf, touching, urging, begging in the only language she had. Kai stood trembling a few feet away, alive and hungry and almost forgotten. In the hush that followed, Ethan heard Rebecca murmur the name they had not meant to give yet, as if naming him might help. "Milo," she said. But the night offered no answer. The name seemed to settle over the enclosure without changing anything. Milo lay where he had fallen into the world, slight and glistening under the moon, his breaths so shallow they seemed borrowed rather than his own. Mara kept working over him with exhausted devotion, sweeping her trunk along his side, nudging beneath his chest, trying again and again to wake a strength that had never fully arrived. Kai had stopped crying. That worried Rebecca almost more than the sound would have. A healthy calf should have been noisy by now, impatient, insistent, demanding the milk and contact its body needed. Instead, he stood on unsteady legs a few feet from Mara, swaying with effort, as if even his instincts were learning they might have to wait. Lena remained close, her presence quiet but deliberate. A soft wall between him and the confusion of the herd. Mara tried a different approach with Milo. She curled the tip of her trunk under his jaw and lifted gently, encouraging his head upright, the way a mother might rouse a sleeping calf. Milo's neck held for only a second before folding again. She nudged his shoulder. She stroked his back. She pressed warm breaths over his face. Each time, the response was smaller than before, and each time her movements grew quicker, less patient, more urgent. On the observation deck, Noah could barely keep still. Every few seconds, he looked from Milo to Kai and back again, as though his eyes alone might help decide which life needed them most. Ethan stood beside him, with his binoculars lowered now, no longer pretending distance gave him control. Below them, the oldest law of the wild was unfolding in front of a fenced sanctuary and a team of people who could only witness it. Rebecca finally spoke what the others were thinking. If he doesn't stand soon, the window starts closing. She did not need to explain what that meant. A newborn elephant needed more than breath. It needed balance, warmth, colostrum, the first immunity-rich milk that would defend it against a world already waiting with bacteria, parasites, weakness, and cold. Miss that opening, and survival became a narrowing road with almost no room left. But Mara did not know biology in clinical terms. She knew only the unbearable difference between one calf who answered touch and one who did not. Kai, though still clumsy, had already found motion in his limbs and direction in his hunger. Milo had entered life as if arriving half from another place, too light, too quiet, too far away. Mara refused that truth with every part of her body that could still fight it. A little before dawn, Milo managed what looked like a miracle. His head rose. One foreleg pushed weakly into the dirt. Noah gasped, and even Rebecca leaned forward. Mara froze for a fraction of a second, then moved in with renewed hope, rumbling softly now, the sound deep and coaxing. But the effort lasted no more than a breath. Milo's leg slipped. His head dropped. The tiny flare of possibility went out as quickly as it had come. That was the cruelest part of it. Not the stillness, but the brief, misleading movements that kept offering Mara reasons to believe. She chased each one like a mother running toward a voice in fog. She touched Milo's belly, then his ear, then his mouth again, trying to call him back into his own body. Old Ruth stood over them like weathered stone, solemn and unmoving, as though she had seen this shape of grief before and knew there was no way around it. Kai found Mara's leg at last and nosed blindly at her skin, searching for the scent of milk. For 1 second, it seemed possible she might turn to him, guide him underneath her, let him nurse while she continued tending Milo. But her attention never broke. Her trunk remained fixed on the smaller calf, tracing patterns of care that had become almost feverish. Kai leaned harder, then lost his balance and sat back awkwardly in the dust. Lena stepped toward him at once, not touching, only rumbling low enough to settle his panic before it grew. It was a strange, aching sight. One mother pouring herself into a fading life, while another female, one who had known loss herself, hovered near the calf who had every chance to live, if only he could reach what he needed. Ethan felt something cold move through him then. The danger in front of them was beginning to split in two. Milo's breathing changed first. It no longer came in shallow but steady pulls. Now each breath seemed delayed, as if his body had to remember how to ask for the next one. Rebecca saw the rhythm and closed her eyes briefly. She had heard that pattern in foals, antelope, zebra, calves of every kind. Once the body began letting go in increments, there was rarely any human wisdom or animal love strong enough to reverse it. Nature was not dramatic when it ended things. It was quiet. Mara seemed to hear the change too. Her own sounds shifted, deepening into something raw and broken at the edges. Not labor anymore, not encouragement either. This was the sound of a mother whose instincts had outrun her power. She pressed her trunk over Milo's chest, then lifted away and did it again, as if trying to restart a rhythm she could feel slipping under her touch. The younger cows turned their heads aside. Even Noah could not look for a moment. The sky had begun to pale in the east by the time Milo took his last breath. It happened so softly that no one knew at first which inhale had been the final one. One moment, his small ribs made the faintest effort. The next, they did not. Mara waited. She touched his side. She touched it again. The world around her kept moving. The wind, the insects, the deep blue giving way to gray. But the little body beneath her trunk had gone somewhere she could not follow. No one on the deck spoke. No one below moved except Mara. She lifted Milo's head with infinite care and set it down more gently than before, as if perhaps he had only fallen into a sleep too deep for ordinary waking. Then she nudged him again, more firmly this time. Kai gave a hungry cry from behind her. Mara did not turn. Dawn spread slowly across the enclosure, and with it came the first terrible shape of what this loss might cost. Dawn did nothing to soften the scene. It only made everything clearer. The pale morning light spread across the enclosure and revealed Mara exactly where the night had left her, standing over Milo's body, her trunk moving across him in small, careful passes, as if tidying the sleep of a child who had been restless. The tenderness of it was almost harder to watch than the death itself. Kai stood a short distance away, still alive, still waiting. His legs trembled with fatigue, and the stubborn brightness that had marked his first hour was fading into something thinner. He reached toward Mara again, making a small, needy sound that would have drawn any healthy mother at once. Mara heard it. Everyone could tell she heard it, but she did not answer him. Her whole being remained fixed on Milo. Rebecca lowered her binoculars and rubbed one hand over her mouth. "He's already falling behind," she said quietly. Ethan did not ask which calf she meant. Kai had gone too long without a proper feeding, and newborn time moved faster than adult time. A strong calf could become a weak one in a single bad morning. A weak one could become a memory before noon. That was the arithmetic no one wanted to say aloud. Below them, Mara bent her knees slightly and used her trunk to pull a scatter of dry grass and leaves closer to Milo's side. The gesture was so deliberate, it made Noah's chest tighten. She was not simply touching the body anymore. She was arranging it. She brushed dirt from Milo's face, nudged one tiny foreleg into a more natural position, then stood over him as though shielding him from a sun he could no longer feel. Kai took 2 wavering steps toward her. When he reached her hind leg, he pressed his head against it and searched under her belly for milk. For one suspended second, Ethan thought instinct might break through grief. Mara shifted, just enough to make room, perhaps, or perhaps only from the strain of standing so long. But then she moved the other way, turning her body back toward Milo, and Kai was shut out once more, without force, without anger, almost without awareness. Noah made a sound of disbelief under his breath. She doesn't see him. Ethan kept watching. She sees him, he said, though he was no longer sure whether that was more hopeful or more tragic. Mara was not rejecting Kai in any ordinary sense. She was trapped, somewhere between two truths, one body that no longer lived, and one living calf her mind seemed unable to return to. The distance between those truths was killing them all. Old Ruth had not left her side. The old matriarch stood close enough to touch Mara when she chose, but never so close that it looked like pressure. Once, she reached out and rested her trunk against Mara's shoulder, then lowered it without insisting on any response. Lena, by contrast, had shifted fully toward Kai now. She hovered near him with a grave, maternal patience, rumbling softly whenever he stumbled or cried, as though holding a place his mother could not yet fill. The rest of the herd seemed altered by the loss. The younger cows no longer formed a tight, protective crescent. Instead, they stood farther back in uneasy silence, ears half lifted, as if listening for instructions that had not yet been given. The enclosure, so charged with expectancy through the night, now carried a different kind of tension, one built not on birth, but on what comes after when love has nowhere safe to go. Rebecca crouched beside a supply crate on the deck and opened a field case she had prayed she would not need. Inside were emergency feeding tubes, sterile bottles, formula packets, gloves, and a small thermal blanket designed for compromised newborns. Noah stared at the equipment as if it were a betrayal. "Can't we help him now?" he asked. Rebecca did not look up. "Not unless we're ready to lose her trust for good." That was the nightmare at the center of everything. If they rushed in and removed Milo's body, Mara might panic, charge, or turn permanently away from Kai in confusion and rage. If they pulled Kai out for bottle feeding too early, they could keep him alive for a while. But perhaps only long enough to raise him motherless beside the living grief of a herd that would never forgive the theft. Rescue was no simple act here. It came wearing a cost. Late in the morning, Ethan stepped away long enough to answer a satellite call from Dr. Samuel Price, a behavioral specialist consulting from the States. He listened in silence, eyes still on the enclosure. Samuel's voice came thin across the line, but his meaning was clear. Grieving elephants could become singular in focus. In rare cases, they had to complete a kind of emotional passage before maternal behavior could fully return. "If you force the ending," he said, "you may break what you're trying to save." When Ethan returned to the rail, Mara was making a new sound, low, rhythmic, and hauntingly soft. It was not the rumble she had used during labor, nor the urgent coaxing she had given Milo while he still breathed. This was slower, almost lullaby-like, as if she were singing to him now instead of calling him back. Noah looked up sharply when he heard it. Even Rebecca, hardened by years of triage and loss, stood completely still. Kai's cries had changed too. Hunger had taken the sharpness out of them. They came less often now, smaller and hoarser, interrupted by pauses that were beginning to last too long. He leaned against one of Mara's back legs and nearly slid to the ground before Lena's quiet rumble steadied him. Ethan saw the sway in the calf's stance, the way his knees softened each time he stopped moving, and felt a cold certainty settle deeper in his gut. By noon, the crisis no longer belonged only to the dead. Milo's still body remained at the center of Mara's world, but Kai's weakening frame had begun to redraw the danger for everyone watching. One calf was gone. The other was slipping. And the most heartbreaking part was that Mara, a mother built by nature to guard life with terrifying devotion, seemed unable to reach the child who still had a chance. Then Kai tried once more to nurse. He pressed under Mara with trembling determination, nudged blindly upward, and lost his balance so badly he crumpled onto his chest in the dirt. This time he did not rise right away. Lena stepped forward at once, and even old Ruth turned her head. On the deck, Rebecca closed the latch on the emergency case with a hard snap. The story had changed. It was no longer about whether Mara could let Milo go. It was about whether Kai would survive long enough for her to remember him. For several long seconds, no one moved. Kai remained folded in the dust where he had fallen, his thin sides fluttering too quickly. Then, not quickly enough. Lena stood over him with her head lowered, giving soft, pulsing rumbles that seemed meant to hold him in place between panic and collapse. Mara heard them. The tips of her ears lifted. But she did not leave Milo. Then, old Ruth changed something. Until that moment, the old matriarch had been a witness, steady, near, silent in the way elders sometimes are when a younger life must fight its own battle. Now she stepped directly between Mara and the widening space beyond Milo's body. She touched the dead calf, once, very lightly, then turned and crossed the few yards to Kai. Her trunk rested on his back for only a second before she looked back at Mara. It was such a simple sequence that Noah almost missed its meaning. Touch the one who was gone. Touch the one who remained. Return the mother's eyes to both truths. Old Ruth repeated it again, slower this time, as though she were teaching a lesson no human ear was meant to hear. Mara lifted her head, watched, then lowered her trunk back to Milo, as if she could not yet bear what the gesture was asking of her. Lena joined in. The younger females backed away without being told, leaving a wider circle around the little family at the center. Lena moved to Kai's side and made a low, fluttering call so gentle it barely seemed possible for a body her size to produce it. Ethan had heard nursing calls before. This was one. Lena was not trying to mother Kai. She was trying to remind Mara what Kai still needed and what only Mara could give. Kai answered weakly, lifting his head and turning toward the sound. He pushed one front leg underneath himself, then the other, and with terrible effort managed to rise. His legs shook so hard they looked hollow. He took one step toward Lena, then another. She did not lead him away. Instead, she angled her body carefully, guiding him in a slow half-circle that pointed him back toward Mara's side. Rebecca watched through the binoculars, without blinking. "They're coordinating," she said, almost under her breath, as if speaking too loudly might break the delicate intelligence unfolding below. Ethan said nothing. He had stopped trying to measure what he was seeing against the limits of training manuals and field reports. Whatever this was, it did not feel accidental. It felt communal, purposeful, pain answering pain with structure. Mara still stood over Milo, but her stillness had changed. It was no longer the fixed, unreachable trance of the morning. Her head lifted more often now. Her trunk hesitated in midair before settling back on Milo's body. Each time old Ruth touched Kai and returned to her, Mara watched a little longer. Grief had not loosened its grip, but something inside it had begun to bend. The shift was tiny. It was also everything. Noah leaned so far over the rail, Ethan had to catch the back of his shirt. "She looked at him," he whispered. It was true. Only for a heartbeat, only a glance, but Mara's gaze had found Kai as he stumbled toward her. The sight of him, alive, hungry, still trying, seemed to strike some hidden place beneath her mourning. Her trunk lifted. For an impossible second, it reached halfway toward him. Then she turned back to Milo again. The hope that rose in the team hurt almost as much as the fear. They had something now, but not enough. Rebecca checked Kai's stance, the angle of his neck, the delayed way he swallowed after crying. He was weaker than he had been an hour earlier. Progress in Mara's mind meant nothing if his body ran out first. She opened the emergency case again, not because she had decided, but because indecision was becoming its own kind of cruelty. Below, old Ruth tried again, but with more insistence. She walked to Milo, touched the small, still form with solemn care, then moved to Mara's shoulder and pressed her forehead there. After that, she turned and placed herself beside Kai, almost shoulder to shoulder with Lena. Two elder females, one seasoned by loss and one by age, standing with the living calf as if presenting him back to his mother in the only language that mattered. Kai gathered himself and cried out, a thin, cracked sound that carried farther than any of his earlier calls. This time, Mara reacted. Her whole body tensed. She swung her head toward him, ears angled wide, trunk raised halfway, as though scent alone might explain what grief had hidden from her. The enclosure went still around her. Even the younger cows seemed to hold their breath. For the first time since Milo died, Mara looked directly at the calf who still needed her. She took one step. It was a small step, barely more than a shift in weight, but Noah felt it like a blow. Kai did too. He lurched toward her at once, encouraged by some instinct older than weakness. Mara's trunk reached him before the rest of her did, brushing his shoulder, then the top of his head. The contact lasted only a few seconds, yet it changed Kai instantly. He leaned into it with desperate relief, pressing what little strength he had left into the place where his mother had finally touched him. Ethan saw Mara's trunk move over Kai's spine, his ribs, the side of his face, as if she were taking inventory of damage she had not known she was causing. The tenderness in that touch was unmistakable. So was the shock. But then, just as quickly, the old current pulled her back. Her trunk withdrew. She turned to Milo again and lowered herself over the dead calf with a broken, protective care that made Noah close his eyes. No one spoke for a long moment. The setback felt crueler than if nothing had happened at all. Yet Ethan could not call it failure. Mara had seen Kai. She had touched him. Somewhere inside the fog of loss, recognition had flickered to life. It just had not burned long enough. Lena stayed with Kai as he sagged in place, while old Ruth returned to Mara's side, patient as time itself. The herd, it seemed, had chosen not to force healing, but to keep leading her back to it, again and again, until she could follow. By the third morning, the entire sanctuary seemed to understand that the night's crisis had changed into something older and deeper. The urgency of birth was gone. So was the frantic disbelief that had followed Milo's death. In its place lay a heavy, solemn quiet, as if grief itself had settled over the enclosure, and every living thing inside it had agreed, without instruction, to move more gently beneath its weight. Mara no longer tried to rouse Milo the way she had through the first terrible hours. Her touches had softened. Instead of nudging for breath or lifting his head, she now brushed dust from his face, smoothed the ground beneath him, and stood guard with the still devotion of a mother keeping watch beside a sleeping child. The change unsettled Ethan even more than the panic had. This was not denial anymore. It was mourning. Kai had survived the night, but only barely. He stood when instinct forced him to, then folded down again with the clumsy slowness of a body running out of fuel. His cries came less often now, and when they did, they sounded thin and scraped hollow. Rebecca did not bother hiding her fear anymore. She kept the emergency kit open at her feet and checked the watch on her wrist so often it had become its own silent ritual. Old Ruth moved first, just after sunrise. She approached Milo with a gravity that changed the posture of every elephant around her. Her steps were slow, deliberate, ceremonial. When she reached the small body, she lowered her trunk and rested it across his back for several long seconds, not in examination, but in acknowledgement. Then she lifted her head and released a low, rolling call so deep it seemed to rise out of the earth itself rather than her chest. The sound drifted through the enclosure and drew an answer from the others. One by one, the females approached. Not hurriedly, not chaotically. Each came forward in turn and touched Milo with a kind of reverence that no one on the observation deck could mistake for ordinary curiosity. A trunk across his side, a breath over his face, a still pause that felt almost like a bow. Then, each elephant remained nearby instead of moving away. Noah stared, forgetting for a moment even to write. "What are they doing?" he asked, but the question sounded too small for what was unfolding. Ethan did not take his eyes off the herd. "Saying goodbye," he said at last, though even that seemed inadequate. Rebecca stood, very still beside them, watching as the loose gathering around Mara tightened into something more organized, more intentional, more hauntingly human in its emotional precision. Mara stayed at the center of it all, motionless except for the tremor in her trunk. She watched each female approach Milo, and with every touch he received, something in her posture shifted, not breaking, not surrendering, but loosening, as if the burden of holding his death alone was being gently lifted from her by the others. Lena remained near Kai, giving quiet rumbles whenever his legs buckled, but even she turned often toward the growing circle around Milo. The ritual deepened with every minute. Old Ruth called again, and this time the sound was followed by a chain of lower, shorter responses from the other females, one after another in a pattern so measured it could not have been random. The younger cows, who had spent the previous day in restless uncertainty, now moved with unusual discipline. The enclosure no longer looked like the site of a failed birth. It looked like the center of a ceremony. Then old Ruth bent and did something that made Noah stop breathing. With extraordinary care, she slipped her trunk beneath Milo's small body and lifted him from the ground. Not high, not in any rough or practical way, but gently, as if she understood that even in death he belonged to the dignity of the herd. Mara flinched at the movement and took a half step forward, but she did not interfere. She followed. The others closed in around them, forming a moving wall of gray bodies around the mother and her dead calf. The procession crossed the enclosure slowly, heading toward a low rise near a broad acacia tree at the far edge of the sanctuary. Ethan had noticed elephants lingering there before on long, silent afternoons, but never with such purpose. Rebecca felt a pulse of alarm when she saw Kai try to follow. He wobbled after Mara for a few unsteady steps, then stumbled, caught, himself, and kept going. "He can't do this," she whispered, though no one had the power to stop him. Lena immediately moved to his side, steadying the space around him with soft, persistent calls. She did not push him. She did not block him. She simply stayed close enough that he did not feel abandoned. It was a kind of caregiving that pierced Noah almost more than Mara's grief had. In another species, in another story, someone would have rushed in, picked the calf up, and carried him to safety. Here help came by staying beside suffering, not by stealing it away. At the rise beneath the tree, old Ruth laid Milo down. The other females arranged themselves in a broad ring while Mara stepped forward and stood over him one last time. The air felt strange there, cooler, more hushed, as though even the morning light knew it had entered a place where ordinary movement no longer belonged. One by one, the elephants began gathering branches, dry grass, and leaves, dropping them near Milo with such measured care that no human watching could mistake the act for random behavior. Rebecca lowered her binoculars, tears bright in her eyes, before she could stop them. She had spent years training herself to see anatomy, behavior, prognosis, outcome. But there was nothing clinical about what the herd was doing now. They were not merely responding to a body. They were participating in loss. They were making room for it, shaping it, giving it a form the living could survive. Ethan, beside her, felt the same terrible awe settle over him. Then Kai fell. He had made it farther than his strength should have allowed, but halfway up the rise, his front legs folded, and this time, he did not spring back. His body hit the ground with a soft, helpless collapse that snapped every human nerve on the deck taut. Rebecca grabbed the emergency case before she was even aware of moving. But below them, before anyone could break the line between witness and intervention, Mara turned at the sound. For the first time since Milo died, she did not look away quickly. She stared at Kai where he lay in the dirt, trembling and too weak to rise. Old Ruth moved then, not toward Milo, but into Mara's line of sight, placing her old body between the dead calf and the living one for one solemn, deliberate moment. And in that suspended silence, with grief on one side and survival on the other, Mara stood facing the choice she could no longer postpone. For one suspended heartbeat, nothing in the enclosure moved. The herd held its shape around Milo's small, covered body, the acacia branches stirring above him in the morning wind. Old Ruth remained fixed between the dead calf and the living one, not as a barrier, but as a witness to the choice that had finally come due. Mara stood in the middle of it, her body turned toward loss, her eyes locked on survival. Kai tried to rise and failed. His front legs slid under him, and his chin struck the dirt with a dull, fragile softness that reached the observation deck like a blow. Lena rushed to his side at once, touching his shoulder with her trunk, making those low maternal sounds she had given him all through the night. But Kai no longer answered with movement. He only blinked slowly, his small sides fluttering with the shallow effort of staying in the world. Rebecca had the emergency kit in her hands before she realized she had grabbed it. Noah was already halfway to the stairs when Ethan caught him by the arm. Not hard, not unkindly, just enough to stop the panic from outrunning judgment. "Wait," Ethan whispered, though every part of him wanted to break his own rule. "Just wait one more second." Below them, Mara had not yet moved, and that stillness was unbearable. Then she let out a sound none of them would ever forget. It was low, long and rough at the edges, carrying not the alarm of labor or the broken pleading she had poured over Milo's still body. This sound seemed to come from deeper than either. It rolled through the enclosure like grief finding a voice at last, heavy, resonant, old as the ground beneath her feet. The younger females went completely still. Even Lena lowered her head and listened. Mara turned first toward Milo. Slowly, with the exhaustion of 3 impossible days in every movement, she stepped back to the small mound of leaves and branches where her lost calf now lay. She lowered her trunk over him one last time, tracing the outline of his covered body with infinite care, as if memorizing what her heart had refused to release. Then she paused there, silent, holding the moment until it felt almost sacred. When she lifted her head again, the whole shape of her had changed. The frantic pull of mourning was gone. The blind urgency that had kept her trapped beside Milo had softened into something quieter and more terrible. Acceptance. She looked at the old matriarch, then at Lena, beside Kai, then finally at the calf in the dirt whose life had been draining away while she stood watch over death. For the first time, there was no confusion in her gaze, only recognition. Mara moved, not in panic, not in a rush. She crossed the short distance toward Kai with a deliberate, trembling purpose that made Noah's eyes fill before he even understood why. Each step seemed to cost her something. The herd opened for her at once, parting without noise. Old Ruth stepped aside. Lena backed away but stayed close enough to steady Kai if he collapsed further. No one interrupted the path between mother and son. When Mara reached him, she did not touch him lightly this time. Her trunk moved over him from head to tail with urgent precision, checking his ears, his ribs, his flanks, his mouth, as though taking inventory of damage too long ignored. She paused at his hollow sides, then at the sharp effort of his breathing, and something like shock rippled visibly through her body. She had not known, or perhaps she had not been able to know until now. Kai answered her with the faintest sound, more breath than cry. It was enough. Mara bent her front knees and began lowering herself with extreme care, folding her massive body toward the ground in a posture she had not taken since before Milo died. Ethan had seen mothers position themselves for weak calves before, but never with such deliberate tenderness. Mara leaned just enough to expose her underside, angling her body to make nursing possible for a calf who no longer had the strength to fight for it. For one terrifying second, Kai did not respond. Rebecca stopped breathing. Noah pressed both hands over his mouth. Lena made a low, trembling rumble from a few feet away, as if encouraging him from the edge of the moment. Then Kai lifted his head. His legs shook violently as he pushed himself forward, collapsing once against Mara's foreleg before trying again. Mara remained perfectly still, her trunk resting lightly across his back, not guiding him now, just anchoring him. At last, Kai found her. The first latch was clumsy, almost lost, then found again. The second held. Then came the sound everyone had been waiting for, the small, desperate rhythm of a starving calf finally drawing milk. It was not loud. It did not need to be. After so much silence, so much waiting, it was the strongest sound in the world. Noah turned away, openly crying now. Rebecca took off her glasses and pressed her fingers to her eyes. Mara did not move as Kai nursed. She remained lowered beside him, rumbling softly, the sound deep and constant, almost like the pulse of calm returning to a body after fever. It was not joy. Not exactly. There was too much grief still standing in the enclosure for joy to fit cleanly there. But it was peace of a different kind, the peace of a mother who had finally found her way back to the child still calling her name. Around them, the herd held a wide and reverent silence. Old Ruth stood nearest, watching with the still authority of someone who had seen life and death braid together many times before. Lena stayed on Kai's far side, no longer needed in the same way, yet unwilling to leave until the calf's trembling eased. The younger females remained under the acacia's shifting shade, their ears loose now, their bodies no longer braced for crisis. On the deck, Ethan let go of Noah's arm at last. He did not say much, because nothing he could say would improve what they had witnessed. A mother had not forgotten her dead calf. She had not replaced one life with another. What happened below them was harder and holier than that. Mara had carried her grief to the edge of losing everything, and then, somehow, she had turned back before the last light went out. Kai kept drinking, each swallow a small act of rescue. Mara lifted her head once and looked toward the acacia rise where Milo rested beneath the branches. She did not try to return to him. She did not call him back. She simply looked, and in that long, quiet glance, there was more sorrow than any human language could hold. Then she lowered her gaze to Kai again and rested the tip of her trunk against his spine as he fed. That was the moment that broke them all. Not the birth, not even the death. It was this: a grieving mother saying goodbye without leaving, choosing the child who still had breath while carrying the one who no longer did. Rebecca would later remember the shape of Mara's body on the ground, the impossible gentleness in her stillness. Noah would remember the first sound of Kai swallowing milk. Ethan would remember the look in Mara's eyes when she turned away from Milo and back toward life. By midday, the light had changed across the enclosure. The wind had softened. Somewhere beyond the fence, birds had begun calling again, as if the land itself were finally exhaling. Kai, exhausted but fed, leaned into Mara's side with the fragile trust of something that had survived by a margin too small to understand. Mara stood over him, no less broken for what she had, lost, but no longer lost inside it. And in the quiet that followed, everyone who had watched understood the same thing. What left them in tears was not simply that an elephant had twins and lost one. It was that her next move was not dramatic at all. It was tender. It was devastating. It was a mother, after unspeakable grief, lowering herself to save the life still standing beside her. If this story touched your heart, leave a 1 in the comments for Mara and baby Kai. If you believe a mother's love never truly forgets, even through grief, leave a 0. And if stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are many more powerful animal stories waiting for you in the next video.